Hello, Ron W. Henley here with the 11th and final round coverage of the 2012 World Chess Olympiad, which is just concluded in Istanbul, Turkey. Well, the three favorites, Ukraine, Armenia, and the Russian Chess Federation, did in fact finish in a three-way tie for first, with Armenia grabbing the gold, Russia the silver, and Ukraine the bronze. China finished fourth, and our U.S. team finished with a spirited fifth place finish. Their final round was a 2.5, 1.5 victory over the team from Poland. And two of those games were rook plus bishop of opposite color. More about that later. Let's look at board 2, where we have Gadakamsky playing the white pieces against GM Bartel Matuz, 26-54. Before we continue though, a few words of thanks, first to our subscribers, secondly to the organizers of the Olympiad. By all accounts, they did a fantastic job and hosted a tremendous event, and the players themselves provided some very spirited fighting chess, which of course gave us fantastic content to make these videos. And last but not least, definitely a special note of thanks to Rex Sinquefeld and the St. Louis Chess Club and Scholastic Center for continuing to support the U.S. men's and women's Olympic team. Okay, so without further ado, let's start on e4, e6, d3, c5, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, castles, and knight g7. Now, of course, we started out with a King's Indian attack move order, but we now have a position that is considered one of Black's better choices in terms of setup against both the King's Indian attack and the closed Sicilian. So, Gada, though, with not having the knight on d2, is able to play c3 and try and create the pawn duo in the center, which after castles, first he plays bishop e3, and then on b6, does in fact establish the pawn duo on e4 and d4. After c takes though, Gada now makes the interesting decision to not play pawn takes, because after bishop a6, rook e1, d5, Black has a pretty solid situation. After e5, both knight f5 or queen d7 are considered rock solid and completely equal for Black. So going back after c takes d4, Gada plays knight takes d4. Black still plays bishop a6, and on rook e1 now plays knight e5, threatening to occupy the d3 square possibly. Knight a3, and now Black plays a bit aggressively with d5 to counter in the center. However, d6 was probably just a bit passive, and White has a little bit more space. So after d5, Gada now plays the excellent bishop to g5, pinning the knight on e7 to the queen on d8. After d takes e4, bishop takes e4, and we can see the rook on a8 is being touched. Black now plays in enterprising fashion. If he just plays routine, mundane move like rook c8, then queen a4 starts to offer White serious initiative. Attacking the bishop, getting ready to swing the rook, White would be completely mobilized and have serious opportunities for some initiative here. So in the game, after bishop e4, Black started playing in very enterprising fashion, and he played queen to d7. Gada plays f4. I think Gada thought taking the rook on a8 might be a bit risky because after, let's say, bishop takes, probably just simply rook takes, and now Black threatens moves like knight to b3. And also possibility of just going back and occupying the long diagonal. And we can see the light squares here, around the king are pretty tender. So in the game though, Gada plays f4, attacking the knight. The knight pops into d3, and Black starts to really play for complications here. After bishop takes d3, Black now plays bishop takes d4. Check. In the game, Gada plays king f1. And this might have been pretty much the critical early stage. One way to go would be to simply play c takes d4, queen takes check, king up, bishop takes d3. Material for the moment is equal, but after bishop e7, White has an extra piece. Queen b2 check. King h1, and now bishop a6 threatens the nasty bishop to b7 check and queen g2 mate. So after bishop a6 though, white needs to just deftly step aside with king g1, and on bishop b7, then knight c2 is very powerful, and white is still a solid piece up. Queen's not great here, and this is a pretty tasty extra bishop. So after bishop d4 check, instead of king f1, we can see that simply capturing was one way to go. Also, instead of king f1, it turns out that king g2 probably deserved attention. For example, bishop b7 check, simply bishop e4. And on bishop takes, rook takes, and we can see the bishop on d4 is pinned to the queen that is unprotected on d7. The knight is also under attack. In fact, it seems to me that black has some serious issues to deal with here. Instead, after bishop takes d4 in the heat of battle, Gata played king f1. And now, black plays in fantastically enterprising fashion. He plays bishop to c5. Double attacking the bishop and keeping this bishop where it's biting in right next to the white king. After bishop takes a6, scooping an extra piece, why not? Suddenly, queen c6, and we see penetration h1, and this king is very exposed. What a disheartening turn of events if you're the white player. Here, Gata played knight c2, but let's take a look how dangerous it is. If bishop e7, queen h1 check, king up, queen h2 check, king d3, rook check, rook takes, and queen takes, with a completely winning position as the whole white position is very, very exposed. So in the game after queen c6, Gata tries to hunker down with knight back to c2, queen h1 check, king e2, queen h2 check, the white king gets forced onto the d-file, rook at a to d8 check, knight to d4. So at this point, in return for the sacrificed piece, black has one pawn, the white king up on the third, and the knight on d4 pinned to the king and the queen. This is, in fact, pretty much a winning position if he would just follow through with bishop takes d4, c takes d4, and queen takes b2. He would have dual threats of rook takes d4 check, and queen check, followed by queen takes. Definitely a winning position for black. Note that after knight d4, bishop takes d4, if Gata tried to bail out like in the game with queen e2, then bishop back to f6 check is a pretty simple solution for black. King c2, trade the queens, trade the bishops, and rook d5. Solid extra pawn, g5 pawn under attack, completely technically winning position for black. So it's amazing black played so fantastic to create the counterplay, and then right here at the key moment he now falters with f6. But that's chess. So Gata plays bishop back to h4, and after bishop takes d4, he finds a fantastic resource, queen e2, simply letting black keep the piece that he captured on d4 and offering to trade queens. After bishop c5 check, king back to c2, and now by a miracle the white king is safe. It's actually even well placed for the ensuing endgame, and Gata has survived the worst. After the trade of queens, black now sees his pawn is under attack and plays the routine king f7 to defend it. However, this was probably his last chance to maintain the advantage by playing knight to d5. For example, rook e6, knight c7 is bad news. La fork. And after knight d5, if rook at a to e1, he can take advantage of the poor placement of the bishop on h4, and he can play the little quiet move h6. This is very unpleasant because the threat is simply g5, snagging the bishop. What's white to do? But instead, one last reprieve for Gata, as black played king f7, and now rook at e1, and knight d5 no longer works because of rook takes e6, knight c7, and rook takes f6 check. So now black goes for knight f5, bishop c4, knight h4, g takes h4, and here we have the very famous 2 rook plus bishop opposite color endgame. Now for the moment, black is actually a pawn ahead, but of course, it's pretty clear that white is simply going to recoup the pawn on e6. Then it will become a question of who can create passed pawns or threats against the enemy king. Just a quick note here, make sure you also check out our bonus coverage where we're going to see that on board 4 of the same match, Grandmaster Ray Robson also got a 2 rook plus bishop opposite color endgame. And the fantastic technique that these two players showed, that turned out to be the margin of victory in the US's victory over Poland. Also, I might note that this particular endgame is of special interest to me because in Win Like Karpov, I devote a whole chapter, and I kind of refer to this as Karpov's, quote, secret weapon. Throughout his career, Karpov scored no less than 10 wins with this endgame. In fact, in the Hastings tournament of 1972, yes, he won this endgame 3 times against grandmasters. Even as late as 2010, in a match against Hu Yafan, the Chinese woman superstar, the only decisive game of the match there was the first game where with black he won a rook and bishop opposite color endgame. So this endgame is very, very useful to have in one's arsenal and not near so easy to draw as a lot of people believe. So after g takes h4, black plays f5, rook takes e6. And this position, of course, is evaluated as completely equal. However, as we will see, there's still a lot of play left. Gata now, in fact, plays h5 to try and loosen up the black king side. He also has the possibility of a timely b4, embarrassing this bishop possibly. Well, black doesn't want b4 to happen at an awkward moment, so he plays a5, but Gata plays a3, reinforcing the possibility. Black now captures on h5, which is actually the correct solution if followed up properly. Gata plays rook h1, looking to recoup the pawn, and now black plays rook d6, offering to exchange rooks, and rook e7 check. And black plays a fairly routine-looking king g6, and believe it or not, this is probably the first inexactitude in this endgame. The proper setup would be king h6, rook back to e2, rook to g6, and now setting up the formation with king g7, rook h5, and h6. And here, the position would still be completely equal. After bishop d3, you can either go rook g2 check, or simply rook f6. This would be the proper formation for black, and everything's still quite okay. Instead, after rook e7, king g6, Gata now shows superior mobility with his rooks, and swings back, threatening to come to the g-file. His bishop is cutting off a lot of squares, and his rook on h1. So we can see the white forces are using the light squares to create problems for the black king. Well, black decided he was under enough pressure, and he sacrificed a pawn to deflect this bishop. However, after bishop takes b5, white now has a 3-to-1 majority and can create 2 connected passed pawns. And remember, we said in this type endgame, what are the 2 objectives? Either A, an attack on the king, or B, create some passed pawns. Black plays h6, but now Gata comes to him from the other end of the board. Bishop e8 check. Very nice. King g7, and then rook takes h5, keeping an eye on the pawn on f5. After rook at d to f6, now b4 sets the queen side in motion. AB, AB, and we can see Gata has made huge progress here. The black passed pawn is on h6, is firmly blockaded by the bishop and the rook. Meanwhile, white has 2 connected passed pawns ready to roll. With 2 connected passed pawns, that means bishop opposite color versus bishop opposite color is a win, rook versus rook is a win, and of course, needless to say, king versus king would simply be a win. So black plays bishop back to d6, touching the white pawn. Rook back to h4. King h7. And now king b3, preparing to roll him up. Rook to g8. Bishop to d7, keeping someone tied to defending the f-pawn. Rook g3, dual purpose move, pins the c-pawn, and contemplates playing to f3 to get behind the f-pawn and collect that. And now, Gata plays rook d2, touching the bishop on d6. Well, what's that all about? Well, the idea with rook d2 is that he threatens bishop takes f5 check. Rook takes f5, rook takes d6, rook f4, and rook h6 with a clearly easy technical win. So rook d2, very timely touch on the bishop. Black plays king to g6, a little extra protection for his pawn. And now very nice, rook d5. Again, renews the threat. After bishop e7, rook back to h1, rook to f3, and now rook to e1. Another touch on this poor bishop that doesn't seem to have a lot of squares. He plays bishop back to d6, but notice bishop to d8, bishop e8 check is very nice. Discovered attack on the king and bishop. Also, instead of bishop d6, if the poor bishop tries to go to f8, well then b5. And here's the move I like. The pawn would like to advance, and after bishop e6, we can see the bishop is used to cut the rook from the pawn. And for example, rook f3, b6, and the lights are on, but no one's home at b8. Just follow that variation for a minute. Let's say the only piece that could get back is the rook. Then you could play b7, and then on rook back, hoping to catch that pawn, then probably a move like bishop c8, and that looks like that should pretty much take care of the case because you're threatening the bishop and you're threatening to promote. So we can see after rook e1, this is pretty awkward for this bishop. So the bishop goes back to d6, but then walks right into bishop takes f5 check. Of course, rook f5, rook d6, rook f6. Pretty simple. You simply trade, and b5. Here we can see, as we've seen in other rook endings in this event, the rook is cutting the king on the f-file. This pawn is very far advanced. This pawn race is not even going to be close, and this rook is out of play. Also, after bishop f5, f takes e5, rook check. If king g7, then rook e7 check, king f8, rook a7, and we can see there's dual threats of rook d8 mate, as well as rook takes h6, scarfing up black's last pawn. So bishop f5 check, this is just really a knockout punch. King f7, bishop g4 touching the rook, and bishop h5 check. Again, beautiful play with the white bishop. The bishop continues to harass the black king, but also keeps this passed pawn pretty well under control. King to g7, and now he gets moving on the other side with the dynamic duo. Black tries to offer an exchange of rooks, and I like what Gata did here. Simply rook at d to maintain the rook on d5 and keep all systems go on the queen side. This keeps an iron lock on the blockade. Well, not seeing what to do, he plays bishop back, but c5. He's ready to bring the king up, the rook up, and just keep nursing everything forward. King back to f8, what to do, and now the final touch. Rook takes, and the passive bishop sacrifice, c6. Black actually resigned here. Why? Because after c6, rook takes h5, c7, rook check, king c4, rook check, and now not king b5, rook takes b4 check, but after rook h4 check, simply king d5, and rook check, and king c6, and that's the end of the story. Note that the pawn on b4 covers the c5 square, the pawn on c8 is ready to queen. beautiful teamwork and coordination by Gatakovsky in this endgame. Very, very instructive, very useful to have in your arsenal so that you can collect some points. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Ron W. Henley on behalf of OnlineChessLessons.net. Thank you.